The U.S. has 4% of the world's people, but 20% of COVID deaths. 1 in every 5 deaths are Americans. African Americans, Latinos, and Indigenous Americans are more than twice as likely to die of COVID than whites. Economist Richard D. Wolff says the richest, most technologically advanced country in the world had the capacity and know-how to be prepared for the pandemic because other infectious diseases have come before. But since our healthcare is tied to the profit motive, we were unprepared. Wolff is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University in New York City. He's a critic of capitalism and says our bipartisan belief that the market provides the best health care has resulted in failure and death. That poorer countries with a greater role for government and health care, like New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam, have adapted much better. Wolff makes note of this blind spot when he warns that right now, the U.S. is in uncharted waters. The Household Pulse survey from the Census Bureau, 50% of Texans are not current on rent or are facing eviction. 30% of adults expect unemployment in their households in the next month, and I think 1 in 7 doesn't have enough to eat. It seems like billionaires have added more than $1 trillion of wealth since the pandemic, and it's like the worst recession since 1946, according to the BBC. What explains that dichotomy there?
Well, I think what you're seeing is you're seeing a capitalist system in its worst moment. I'm not even clear that we're going to get out of this disaster. It's so bad. Maybe the way to put it is this way. In 1918, we had the so-called Spanish flu. It killed 700,000 people. It was a public health disaster. But it did not happen at the same time as an economic crash. The economic crash came 12 years later in 1929, but then we went through a terrible capitalist crash, but thankfully without a public health disaster at the same time. What we have now is unprecedented. We were not prepared for the economic crash, which, by the way, is itself an unspeakable failure of the system. Capitalism in the United States and everywhere else in the world has an economic downturn on average every 4 to 7 years. It's called the business cycle or recession or depression or boom and bust. I mean, we have loads of terms for it because it is such an ever-present reality. We were not prepared, even though the last one was in 2008 and 9, and if you do the arithmetic, 4 to 7 years, it happens again. We were overdue already by 2018 for the next one. And there's a kind of rule in economics, the longer it takes for the next downturn to happen, usually the worse that downturn turns out to be. And so we weren't prepared for that. And I've already gone through how we weren't prepared for the public health attack of the virus. To have both of those crises happen at the same time and to be unprepared for both of them, that's a combination of challenge and failure to respond that explains, why we are in the unspeakable disaster. The government of the United States did not come in and compensate for the failure of the private sector. It did not do it before the virus struck, and it did not do it after the virus struck. The politicians needed to pretend we didn't have a crisis because they fear that they would be blamed for it. They were right. Mr. Trump isn't president in large part because he chose to pretend there was no crisis. That kind of denial has been standard operating procedure. For example, right now, there's a massive denial that we're in an economic crisis. Yes, there are some people who see it and admit it, but you turn on your average TV or radio show and, you'll have some person telling you how the stock market is doing well or coming up with something else to point to just so they don't have to face that yes, once again, this capitalist system is treating us to a crash in which millions of people are unemployed. It's the usual collection of horrible stories, to which added now, because we're really in a bad way, the fact that at the same time that we have 20 or 22 million Americans collecting unemployment compensation, either from one of the 50 state governments or from the federal government or from both, that at the same time you have those people in terrible economic shape, using up whatever little savings they might have accumulated, becoming burdens on their families and friends and neighborhoods, starving cities and towns of the kind of tax revenue without which they can't function. In the midst of all of that, you have the 600 billion billionaires accumulating more wealth. I mean, how much evidence do you need that an economic system has outlived its social usefulness than that? Why people are amazed at the events like the one that happened in Washington on January 6th, the only thing I find amazing is that people find that amazing. What are you doing to people? You're making them crazy. That's why QAnon and nutty things like that begin to capture the minds of people, because their world is being destroyed all around them. The future for their kids is grim. I mean, you're going to get, if not this Trump, we'll have a new Trump. If you don't take the kinds of massive steps to correct this accumulated disaster, and my fear is that that's not coming from the Biden administration, then these people are kind of treading water. And what they will get in 4 years is another Trump, and if he's less gross and less vulgar than this one, he'll be better able to stay in power. So it worries me a lot more than I can get across in a few minutes.
For the People's News, this is John Moeller reporting.